Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we saw Mike go through several jobs and find love, and he also gave his views on the Beatles and the Maharishi after the death of Brian Epstein. So today is going to be the final episode of the Max, and we'll see what he's been up to today. The year is 1968, and Mike talked a little about his home named Sunset, formerly known as Lismore. It was he and his wife's dream cottage home. He said it was a little small at first, but after they fixed it up, it took shape around them. He said it was satisfying to do it that way, having built it up around them, instead of what happened when he and Jim moved into Rembrandt. He thought they had too much too soon. Sunset was only a half an hour from Liverpool, and they had complete privacy with private sunset views over the North Wales coast, the River Dee, and the Irish Sea. Not only that, it was only 5 miles from Rembrandt and Dad. In June, just after he got married, the Scaffs were booked into their first Albert Hall apartheid concert entitled Come Back Africa, starring Sammy Davis Jr., Cleo Lane, among others. Later in the year, they played the London Palladium and were introduced to Princess Margaret and her husband, Tony Armstrong Sidley Jones. When Mike was on a plane one day, he was going through the newspapers and he spotted a Beatle article in which the last quote of the year was made by Ringo. We'll never completely split, and we signed a lot of papers, so we stayed together for 20 years or something, Mike said. God love him. Then Paul gets married. Since Paul was best man at Mike's wedding, Mike was obliged to be the best man the following year. Jane Asher had left Paul's North London home, and Paul was wooing Linda Eastman. She was a freelance photographer. On March the 10th, Paul was online from London to his hotel room, and he told Mike, "I'm getting married to Lynn tomorrow. Do you want to be my best and don't tell anyone?" Beatlemania was still going wild at the time, and Paul was the last single Beatle. Mike settled down into a restless sleep. He said he thought of his new sister-in-law, heavily confused with Eastman Kodak cameras, filled the small hotel room, and he wondered what she would be like. Would he like her? Would she like him? Then Micah thought about the ring, and Paul said, "Don't worry, I've got the ring. You just be at Marylebone Registry Office," and he told him to get some sleep. Mike said miraculously his alarm went off and the train was on time, but the next train that he was trying to get to was broken down and he was over an hour late. Mike got into the limo and called to see if they were all still at the registry, and when they got down there was a bunch of people around the entrance. Mike got inside and Paul asked politely, "Where the bloody hell have you been? You're an hour late." And then he told him the train broke down, and Mike asked if the ceremony had already taken place, and Paul said, "We had to wait for you." Luckily, there were other weddings going on. Mal Evans gave Mike the ring, and then they went into the ceremony. Leaving the building, there were crushing crowds and media flashing, questionings, and kids screaming in agony that Beatle Paul had finally fallen. His brother and new sister-in-law asked him to join them back at the house for a glass of champagne. Mike said, "I'd love to," but he was working. Later, he found out that Paul had work to do, too. That night, Paul had to finish a recording session with Billy Kingsley and Jackie Lomax's band. Now we come to Let It Be. One day, during the filming of the Beatles' final hours together in Let It Be, Mike was passing their Apple Studios in Savile Row after a scaffold photo session, and Mike decided to pop in to show Paul his posh new leather coat. Filming was going on in the basement studio, and Mike said he slipped in quietly behind a grand piano and started to play it with the lid closed, of course, doubling up with Billy Preston on the electric piano, and he said Lindsay Hogg didn't keep it in his filming. Mike said at this time Paul was going through his bearded back to the roots scruffy period and wearing his old herringbone overcoat. After the film, they both left Apple and walked through the busy London streets looking for a taxi to take them to Paul's home and his new bride. They hadn't gone far when there was a screech from a lady passing by, and she said, "Oh, look, there's Mike McGear," so nobody recognized Paul. Rumors of Paul's death. When Mike and his group Scaffold were in New York appearing at the Bitter End Club, they were asked to be on the Mike Douglas Show. When they got to the TV studio, they were introduced to Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and then they were asked to take their seats in the audience. Mike said they had done a few strange shows in their short showbiz lives, but not many in the audience. He thought it must be an American custom. It was time for the show, and no one had come to them to tell them what they had to do. Mike and Doug talked a bit, and then they introduced their next guest, a DJ from L.A. Mike said it was at this time that the Paul is dead rumor was spreading around the United States and getting enormous exposure. The disc jockey they had on the show was the one who started the rumor on his Los Angeles show. Mike said he went through his whole con with Mike Douglas. Paul's Back to the Front on the Pepper album, Paul's Shoes Off on the Abbey Road album, Paul's this and Paul's that, all proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Paul was definitely dead. Mike was getting angry, and then Mike Douglas asked him to comment. Mike said that apart from being too silly to waste valuable time on, it was a gigantic, well-planned hoax based on groundless innuendo and straight lies. But most of all, Mike said, how could you, Mr. L.A. DJ, condone or live with the precise moment in time when millions of young, loving, trusting teenagers heard that their biggest pop hero was dead? There was a stunned silence, and Mike said showbiz was never like this, especially on a cozy afternoon live network telly to middle America. He said Mike Douglas covered beautifully, and they went to commercial. Mike said he didn't realize the impact he had caused till they were halfway up the studio staircase, and the numbed DJ came out of his coma. Turning around, he spat down the stairs. He said to Mike, you effing B, word. You call yourself a effing professional. You couldn't lick my, you effing blink, and various other expletives. So they dragged him up and away from Mike, arms flailing, and that day he realized that he would never be a really true professional because sometimes there are more important things than a professionalism. I think they call it telling the truth. I wouldn't mind, but the cad wasn't even British. So Mike got to shake the Queen's hand. Scaffold had been asked to appear at the Royal Gala performance to celebrate the opening by Queen Elizabeth II of Liverpool's second Mersey Tunnel. After they did the show, there was a knock on the dressing room door. They wanted Scaffold at the front of the house to be presented to the Queen. Mike thought no chance, and anyway, she thinks I'm a flasher. Mike said the members of Scaffold were royal bootlickers and went out to the door in a split second. Mike looked in the mirror and asked himself, you're a contrary man, aren't you? And what have you got against the Queen? Answer, nothing. You must be anti-royalist then. Not particularly. Then why not be a sensible lad and join the Scaffold in line then? At least you'll be able to tell your children that you once shook hands with the Queen of England. So Mike got there just in time. Just as the Queen slowly walked round, Mike managed to squeeze his wife next to him for good measure. He said he was suddenly holding the Queen's hand, and her hand was in a white glove. He said she turned out to be a charming lady, just like Auntie Dill. It was approaching the midnight hour, and the Queen stated, I would love to stay, but I simply got to go catch my train. And Roger McGow said, why don't you get the next one? So now Paul started Wings. In 1971, Paul launched Wings, and people were talking about it because he put his non-singing wife in the band. Paul said, sod them, it's my band and I'll have who I want in it. Mike thought that Linda would have been happy being at home cooking spaghetti turkey dinners, but this way she could be with her fella as he winded his way around the world. Then Mike creates a children's book. So Mike created his first children's book entitled Roger Bear. He said it was a joy to write. And John Lennon said, we love your book. And Yoko added, we'll read it next week. So just as Mike was getting comfortable being a kiddie book writer, Paul got back from his Band on the Run African episode and suggested they make a single entitled Leave It to make money. Oh, that turned into the McGear album. The year was 1974, and it was made with Paul, Linda, Denny Lane, Jimmy McCulloch, and Jerry Conway, who was Cat Stevens' drummer. They were at Strawberry Studios, and they were working on a boring track when in walked the Carpenters. They sat listening in the corner for a few hours, and then Mike realized they hadn't come to see him. They wanted to see Paul. They were McCartney freaks. Now we come to the McGear record. When the McGear album was done, Mike was signed to Warner Brothers Records, and he got an advance of $50,000. Mike said he never saw any of it. It went to convert record costs. He called him to ask him if he would promote his album in the United States. Mike said no thanks. The promoter said that it would be a short tour from New York to Los Angeles. Mike said that the U.S. was a mite too big for him, and could they promote it without him? The promoter said that the U.S. didn't know him very well as far as record sales go. They needed him to talk to the media and help move the product, so Mike agreed to do it. When Mike was in New York, Derek contacted him and asked him if he wanted to see John Lennon. Great, it'll be good seeing the old sod after all these years, but for God's sake, don't let the baby Beatle freak know where we are going. Mike told John he was hawking his albums across the states, and John said, don't knock it, son. I was plugging my new single on the same radio station as you just 2 days ago. He told Mike that he saw a flying saucer, and Mike thought he was joking, but John said, honest, Mike, He said he'd been sunbathing naked when something moved at incredible speed and shot against the reflection in the window. Looking up, he saw a UFO hovering over the East River. After pinching himself, he called May out to verify he wasn't going crazy. John said to Mary, "Just tell me I can't see a flying saucer." And then she said, "But there is a flying saucer, and it's got a red light on top." It hovered for a while, and then it shot down the river at a high speed and out of sight. The next day, several sightings were reported from the block of apartments opposite. So Mike then asked, "So you did see a UFO?" And John said, "Yep, I did." Now we come to when Jim McCartney died. On March the 18th, 1976, Jim McCartney died. Mike said Dad had joined Mom on the other side of life. Mike remembered one time when Jim was in the middle of one of his crippling arthritic periods, and he had seen Mr. Death and told him, "Sawed off, I'm not ready." He made a remarkable recovery, but this time it was too much for him. He said Ange, his stepmother, had told him that Jim said just before he died, "I'll be with Mary soon." Mike said at least he knew where he was going. And he was with his dad when he died, along with his wife, Aggie, their smallest child, Abby. Mike wanted to sit with Jim alone in the bedroom of his last bungalow home in Heswall, not far from Rembrandt. Mike kept waiting for him to wink at him, but he just lay there silently, the white sheet over his chest, unusually still. The funeral came on March 22nd, and Mike was a little late. He got into the car behind his dad's, and he heard one of his close relatives say, "Mike will be late for his own bloody funeral." And Mike thought, "I hope I bloody him." So Paul was on the continent at the time of the funeral. Like Dad, who'd apologized for not being able to hold our stomachs in when as kids they were sick. Paul would never face that sort of thing. As his dad would say, "It's just the way you're made, son." Jim wanted to be cremated, and he took him to Landacan Cemetery, not far from Heswall. Then they found out how many friends Jim had. They came from all over. Mike had a family photo put in his casket, and shortly after, stepmother Ange dropped off two things at Mike's house: the Drake's drum painting that Paul had made for him, and Dad's last keepsake, Mom's ring, not even a wedding one, and he tried it on every finger. The only one that it felt nearly comfortable on was the wedding finger. He said that is where it rests. He said he'll wear it until the day he dies, and then it'll be passed on to the daughter that wants it the most. On May 24th, Wings of America ended in New York's Madison Square Garden, and it was a huge success. George Harrison the year before had not had so great a response when he had his tour. Then Mike's single, Do Nothing All Day, Did Nothing All Year. Linda McCartney celebrated her 24th birthday, and she gave Mike a signed first copy of her book, Linda's Pictures book. Mike said, "P.S. I hope you've got it. It's a good book." January 26, 1977, Paul called Mike to let him know about a new McCartney member, James. The odds weren't that great of Paul having a boy after having those girls. When Paul's baby boy was placed on Mike's lap, he thought he was a mini dad with his pulling Jim's faces. On April the 1st, 1977, Jim and Scaffold performed their last live gig together. Mike's marriage ended in September 1977, and Mike started to write his book in Tom Mitchell's monastery in Gorebridge near Edinburgh. He collected material letters, newspaper clippings, photographs, a little experience, and a lot of memories with the passing years. Mike ends the book by saying after 22 years he decided to visit his mother's grave. He had a hard time finding it, and she's buried with her mom, Mary Teresa, 3 children, and the lady she left home for, stepmother Rose Mohin. Mike said all wounds are healed in death, it seems. He asked to be left alone at the grave, and he thought about nothing, just being. At the time the book was published in 1981, Mike said he was still living at Sunset with 3 beautiful growing kids and was about to dive, last time, no more, into the ocean of producing his own and other people's songs, writing, and might even start back Scaffold. He hoped everyone enjoyed traveling through his life and mind, because he did. So I really enjoyed spending time with Mike and his memories of his family. They seemed like they would be really great to hang around with. We got to see the close bond Mike has with his brother, Paul, and how they were both each other's best man, and they even created music together. Mike knew his brother couldn't handle their dad's death, and even Jim knew how Paul was, so no hard feelings when he didn't go to Jim's funeral. And then Mike got to see John Lennon a few times and marveled at John's UFO story. It seems Mike stays as busy as his brother Paul, so it must be a McCartney trait. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you give it a thumbs up, it'll help my channel to grow, and I would really appreciate it. And then, as you know, I started creating a list of merchandise from Amazon that if you might be interested in, you just click on the link and it takes you to the Amazon page. And if you purchase it, I get a small commission that is no extra cost to you. But more importantly, I wish everybody a good day and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.